All right, hello again. This is Jeff Scott at Blackhawk Technical College. And right now I'll be starting the actual chapter lectures for the 152-147 Relational Database Development class for the spring 2016 semester at Blackhawk Technical College. I'll be leaning heavily on the book that we're using for the class, and that book is Murock's MySQL second edition. So I'm going to do most of my work here, as I already mentioned, from the command line. You don't have to do that. You can use either MySQL Workbench, as is mentioned in the book, or PHP Myadmin, as I mentioned in an earlier lecture. But I'm going to bring up the AP database, so I'm going to use AP. And in your book on page 11, they go through the vendors table. So I'm going to show tables. Hopefully I've got a table in there named vendors, and you can see that I do. All right. So notice I typed in here show tables, used AP, use AP. In fact, let's take it from the top. I'm gonna get out of here and I'm gonna start all over again. All right. So I'm gonna click the shell over here. Okay. So I'm gonna click shell. I'm gonna type in MySQL -u root, not toot, root, and that brings me into MySQL. Now, if I want to see the databases I currently have, I can type in show databases. All right. And it shows me the databases that I have. You won't have all these because some of these I've created for other classes and for practice, etc. All right. So I want to be able to make the AP database the one I'm working with. So I say use AP. And all of these commands that I put in here are case insensitive, just so you know. All right. So now I can say what tables are inside of my inside of my AP for accounts payable, which are in that database. And you can see there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 tables. One of those tables is called vendors. All right. So if I want to see what vendors looks like, if I type in DESC, which means describe in this case, vendors, that shows me what's called the schema for this database. It says I have these fields: vendor ID, vendor name, vendor address 1, vendor address 2, vendor city, vendor state, vendor zip code, vendor phone, vendor contact last name and first name, vendor or default terms ID, and default account number. Now you can see how wide these are. If you add all this stuff up, it's going to be several hundred characters. And I have about, I don't know what it is, 80 characters going across, something like that, in here. So I can't show you all of this at one time. But if I wanted to show you, for example, let's say just the vendor ID and the vendor name. All right, then I can type in select vendor ID, comma, vendor name from vendors. And you see I get 122 results back. There they are. And they're not really in any kind of order. Shouldn't say that. I guess they're in alphabetic order based on the vendor name. If I wanted them in order based on the ID, and you can see they're not, then I could run the same command. But instead of saying this, in fact, I'm going to start doing it like this. Select from vendors, order by, which means I want to do a sorting, vendor ID. I can either just do it like that or I can put ASC in there. But since that's the default, I'm never going to do that. Notice the difference when I do this now. Notice how they're in order now. Earlier they were in alphabetic order, and they were in alphabetic order based on the vendor name. You can see that. Now I told them to be in order, in ascending order based on the vendor ID. All right. What I'm showing you in here is a table. All right. In this particular database, we have, as we said, 8 tables. All right. Those are the tables that we currently have listed in our database. Okay. When I described my table, my vendors table, you saw that one of the fields, vendor ID, said pry in front of it, and auto increment, which means pry means it's the primary key, which means that's our unique record identifier, and auto increment says automatically when we put in a new vendor, automatically give them the next number that exists for us. We also have a field vendor name that says UNI after it. What does that mean? That means that each vendor name must be unique. It's not a primary key, but each vendor name that's in there must be unique. All right. Now, you already saw this, so these are the fields that are in our vendors table. How about if we do the same kind of thing and we say describe invoices? These will show us the fields in our invoice table. All right? So you can see that looks a lot nicer to the eye. But notice we've got vendor ID here, and we've got vendor ID here. What that means is that we're actually able to combine information from these two tables because we have a field in common. In other words, let's say that I want the vendor name of each vendor, and I want the invoice number and the invoice date. So I can say this: select vendor name, comma, invoice number, comma, invoice, I don't remember what we said, date from, but since it's from two tables, I have to say from vendors, comma, invoices, and there's different ways I can join these together, but I'm going to say where vendors dot vendor ID equal invoices. You're going to learn how to do this later. Dot vendor ID. And what you notice in here is I've got information now from two different tables. I've got from the vendor name, I've got the vendor. From the vendor table, I've got the vendor name. From the invoice table, I've got the invoice number and the invoice date. This is all stuff that you're going to be learning. Okay? Let's go back again, and one more time, let's describe, but since it's easier to read, we'll describe the invoices table. And you'll notice this invoices table, as we look at it, has what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different fields in it. The first field, the invoice ID, is what's called a primary key. It's a unique record identifier. So each invoice, each record that we put into the invoices table must have a unique vendor ID. I should say a unique invoice ID. The second field is vendor ID. We put that field in there because that field also existed inside of our other table that we saw earlier, our vendor table. See how our vendor table has a vendor ID and it's the primary key. And then notice how our invoices table has a vendor ID, but it doesn't say pry by it. All right, this goes into talking about something that I've discussed in the PowerPoints, and I'll say it again now. This is how we're relating these tables together. This is how you get relational database management systems. We are going to be able to relate the invoice table to the vendors table because we grabbed the primary key from the vendors table, vendor ID, and added it as what's called a foreign key in our invoices table. There is what's called a one-to-many relationship between vendors and invoices. Every one vendor may have 0, 1, or more invoices. So the one side, the parent side, is vendors. The child side, or the many side, is invoices. So we take and copy the primary key from the parent table into our child table, and that becomes what's called a foreign key. You'll notice that we've got a few other things in here. Let's look at, so these are just our field names. These are our data types. So int means that it's a whole number. Varchar means that it's a variable length field up to 50 characters. Date means it's a date field. Decimal means it's got 9 maximum digits in it. So imagine 9 nines. And the last 2 would come after a decimal place. So the biggest number we can put in there for invoice total and payment total is $9,999,999.99. Notice for null, these all say no, which means we don't allow those to be blank. Except for payment date, which can be left blank. I don't even remember what the MUL means right here, so let's just skip that for right now. All right. The default, don't worry about it. Notice we haven't set defaults. That's why it says the word null there, except for payment total and credit total. If we leave those off, they will default to 0.00, $0.00. And again, the invoice ID is a primary key. We want it to be an auto increment field. Now, in your book, they actually show a copy of what this database would look like. I don't know if it's in the PowerPoints or not, but I'm going to check so you can see this. If it's not, I'll just have to tap dance my way out of this. All right, this is what I wanted to show you right here. This is called an EER diagram. In fact, most of the time, it's called an ER diagram, which stands for an entity relationship diagram. An EER diagram is an enhanced entity relationship diagram. But what I want to show you here is the relationship that we have between vendors and invoices. So these are the tables that we have in our AP database. And you'll notice there is a relationship between vendors and invoices. There is another one between vendors and terms, one between invoices and terms, one between invoice line item and invoices, one between general ledger accounts and vendors, and one between general ledger accounts and invoice line items. So you can see that directly or indirectly, all of these tables are related to one another. And again, vendor ID is the primary key here. You can see in each one of these, they have a little yellow key. Sometimes it's on one field, and in here it's called a composite or combined or concatenated primary key because it's on 2 fields. But we've got vendor ID here, and we've also got it here. When it's got the little red thing in there, basically that means that it's put in there as a foreign key. All right. Now notice over here, this looks a little like train tracks, and that looks a little bit, this is actually called crow's feet right here. When you see the railroad tracks, that's the one side of a one-to-many relationship. When you see the crow's feet, that's the many side. So there is a one-to-many relationship between vendors and invoices, meaning that every one vendor can have 0, 1, or more invoices. There is a one-to-many relationship between terms and vendors, which means that every one term can apply to 0, 1, or more vendors. There is a one-to-many relationship between terms and invoices, which means, again, every one term can apply to 0, 1, or more invoices. There is a one-to-many relationship between vendors, we already looked at that one, between invoices and invoice line items, which means that every one invoice can contain 0, 1, or more line items. There is a relationship between general ledger accounts and invoice line items, meaning that every one general ledger account may contain 0, 1, or more line items. There is a one-to-many relationship between general ledger accounts and vendors, meaning that every one general ledger account can have 0, 1, or more vendors associated with it. Now, I went through that quickly. It's all in the book, and it is very important that you take the time to actually take a look at that and hopefully at least understand what that is. In much the same way, much of this class concentrates on SQL, DML, data manipulation language statements, and DDL, data definition language statements. Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes, I give myself little visual cues to remember this stuff. This is how I do it. You might think it's silly, but I put in here select, update, insert, and delete. Why? Look at every letter that I put in capital letters. S, T, U, P, I, D. So that's my own little acronym for remembering these. Stupid. On the other hand, the other one's easier. So those are your DML commands, your data manipulation language commands. Those are the commands that actually manipulate the data in your database. All right, so these are DML commands. The DDL commands are simpler. DDL, because if I just put them in there like this, and I put in create, alter, and drop, if you grab those first three letters from the first letter from each word, you get CAD. Maybe that's silly, but it's a way for me to remember this stuff. All right? So you'll have to understand, while the class goes on, learn how to use these statements and these statements. That's a big part of this class. All right? So let's see. Let's go through the rest of the chapter as far as what's in the book. All right? Now, much of this stuff, Chapter 1 in this book is kind of like Chapter 1 that you see in many books. And what I mean is they try to throw a kitchen sink at you in Chapter 1. They want you to understand everything, which may or may not be a good thing to do. All right? But they talk here, and this is actually one of the things that's in that file that I went and added when we created the databases. So this is an example of a DDL, a data definition language statement. Create, then you have to let the system know when you use a create or an alter or a drop, what kind of database object are you going to create or alter or drop? I'm going to create a table. I'm going to call it invoices. Then in between the parentheses, I have to list each name, the data type of each name, and any special constraints that I have for each name. And when I say each name, those are the fields or columns that go into this table. Then when I get done, I've got what are called constraints. And what I'm doing here is I'm setting up two different foreign keys. So I'm able to relate some of the fields in this table to some of the fields in other tables. Okay. Again, this is Chapter 1. So if it doesn't totally make sense, don't worry about it. Really. All right. I'm going to jump up to page 27 in the book. And on that page, they start putting in some queries. Okay. So I'm going to put in the same queries that they have in the book there on page 27. So it says select invoice number, invoice date, invoice total, payment total, credit total, and then a brand new field that we're going to create on the fly that says invoice total minus payment total. And I can see I put a mistake in there, so this isn't going to work, but well, that's okay. I'll show you how to fix that in a second. Minus credit total greater than 0. I'm sorry. Minus credit total as balance due from invoices where invoice total, again, this isn't going to work, but it's fine. Minus payment total minus credit total greater than 0, order by invoice date. Now it tells me that I've got an error, but I can use DOS key here, which means I can use my up arrow to get myself back here. So select invoice number, which is correct. The next one should be invoice date and invoice total. All right, so I hit enter, use my DOS key again. Payment total, and then I spell credit wrong. So I come back in here and change that. Keep using DOS key here. From, nope. Invoice total minus payment total minus credit total as balance due. Okay. From invoices, where this, I didn't want that. Yeah, I got an error message. Let me just start that over again. In fact, let's do this. The one thing I don't like about doing things from the command line, like I'm doing them right here, is there's no way to clear the screen. If there is, I've never found out what it is. So, use AP. So let's just start typing the stuff in that we want to put in here, okay? All right, so select invoice number. So I want the invoice number. Invoice date. So I want the invoice date. Invoice total. So I want the total. Also, I want the payment total. And I want the credit total. And I want a brand new field that's going to be the invoice total minus the payment total minus the credit total. And since it's a new field, I want to give it a name I want to give it, so I'm doing what's called aliasing it here. I'm saying as balance due. I want to grab all that information from the invoices table, and I want to do it where the invoice total minus the payment total minus the credit total is greater than 0. And then I want to order that, so I want to sort it by invoice date. All right. So it comes out, it looks a little bit ugly right here, okay? And if I want that all to fit where it looks a lot nicer, just to show you how I can do that, I can select the invoice number. I can say as INV number, so I'm going to make it a little easier for me to read. Invoice date as INV date. Invoice total as INV total. So I've got that. As pay tote. As cred tote. Let's change this to bal due, where I'm going to make all these as small as I can. All right, so I've got all that. From invoices, I need my where statement. And I need my order by statement. Doggone. All right, let's try it one more time. Oh, I'm using the word in there, which is a key word in the language. So that's why I think it's blowing up right there. So let me fix that. And actually now I think it probably, whoops. All right, so the invoice number, the invoice date, the invoice total, the payment total, credit total, the balance due, from invoices where all of that is greater than 0, ordered by this. And it's still giving me an error. Doggone it. All right, let's do it like this. Let me show you it using PHP Myadmin. So I'm going to come over here to admin. Maybe this is the way I should be working on this. I don't know. All right, so I want to use our AP database. So I'm going to click here under AP. All right. Now I want to write myself an SQL query. Okay. So I can just start typing now. Select invoice number, invoice date, invoice total, payment total, credit total, and then this invoice total minus payment total minus credit total as balance due from invoices. Let's see if just that part works. Okay, so I've got all that. I'm going to copy this to the clipboard. And I'm going to click go. And you can see it gave me that information. That's good. All right, so I've got all that information. So everything I put in there worked. I'm going to click SQL again. I want to paste in what I just had. And now I want to say where invoice total minus payment total minus credit total is greater than 0, order by invoice date. All right, I can click go, and there's my query. And you can see here are my invoices. So here's my invoice numbers, and they're all in based on the date. And if I take my invoice total and I subtract my payment total and my credit total from that, I get the balance due. So the only one that has had any kind of payment or credit is right here. All right. Now, what I just showed you is how to do this using PHP Myadmin. Okay. And again, just to show you that one more time, if I'm in here, if I'm at the XAMPP control panel underneath the second admin, the one that's on the same line, so to speak, as MySQL, if I click there, that brings up PHP Myadmin, which is another GUI. I like using this better than I like using the MySQL workbench. All right. They have another query that's in here, and I'm not going to type in every query that's in here because that would just be silly. I have neither the time nor the desire to do that. but there's another one on page 29. So again, since I brought it back up again, I've got to click AP to make that database active. Then if I want to enter my own query, I click SQL right here. All right, and now I can type in select vendor name, invoice number, invoice date, invoice total from vendors. And now we're going to actually grab, and we're going to say here inner join, which means I want to bring together the vendors table with the invoices table. This is the other way to write a join. And I want to do that where the vendors.vendor ID is equal to the invoices.vendor ID, where I've got an invoice total that's greater than or equal to 500, and I want to order it by first the vendor name and then the invoice total in descending order. And I click go, and there's my answer. So that pretty much is it for the first chapter, but a couple things quickly. They talk about coding guidelines on page 33. You've got to write these things so that it's the simplest as possible for you to read. And what I mean is, notice if I want to do this. So if I come in here and I say select vendor name, comma, vendor address 1, vendor address 1, comma, vendor city, comma, and I start typing here vendor state, and I hit enter and I say from vendors. There's absolutely nothing wrong with putting it in like that. It works just fine. And as you can see, I get that information. Boom. Everything's cool. If you're a more anal person, you might want to sit there and really line stuff up. So some people like to do it like this. Even more than that, what some people like to do is they like to take keywords which appear here in red, and they like to put the keywords in uppercase. Now, that does not make the query run any better, but if that helps in your understanding of what's going on, the output is exactly the same. So then by all means, do it that way. Do it in whatever way makes the most sense to you. All right. So what I'm going to do is for chapter 2, which I'm going to start up in just a few minutes, rather than giving you a quick little down and dirty on MySQL Workbench, I'm going to show you how to use PHP Myadmin. So I'll be coming back to show you that in just a couple minutes.